Harlem in the late 1930s carried two sounds at once: the trumpet's bright defiance spilling from club doors along Lenox Avenue, and beneath it, a lower note, a vibration of tension that never quite left the pavement. Street lamps flickered like tired sentries. Men in pressed suits leaned against brick walls, speaking softly about politics, about business, about survival. Women walked with dignity sharpened by experience, heads high despite the sideways glances from uniformed officers who patrolled with an air of selective authority. And above it all, like a steady metronome marking the tempo of the neighborhoods, Heartbeat moved Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He did not rush. He did not posture. He did not announce himself with spectacle. He moved the way a man moves when he understands that real power rarely needs to prove itself. His shoulders were square, his suits immaculate even in summer heat, his gaze observant, but never hurried. Harlem trusted him not because he was loud, but because he listened. And in a city that often refused to listen to Harlem at all, that quality alone made him indispensable. That week began like any other, with music spilling from the Savoy Ballroom and arguments over chessboards in barbershops. But on a humid Tuesday evening, a messenger arrived at Bumpy's office above a small storefront pharmacy. The young man's hat was in his trembling hands, his breath uneven. He carried no letter, no official notice, only a story that would begin unraveling something far darker than business rivalry or street politics. They took him, the young man said, voice barely holding. They made a show of it. The name that followed struck like a hammer against an anvil. Isaiah Johnson, Bumpy's sister's eldest boy. 20 years old, studious, quiet, the kind of young man who preferred books to bravado. He had been found in an abandoned rail yard north of 135th Street, beaten, strung up, and left beneath a water tower as though he were a warning nailed to Harlem's sky. No one said the name of the organization aloud at first, but everyone understood the implication. White robes were rarely seen openly in New York, yet ideology traveled north as easily as train smoke. Hate did not require a uniform to operate. It required only cowardice and the belief that no one would answer. Bumpy did not rise from his chair immediately. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in disbelief, but in calculation. Grief came later. Anger, if allowed too early, clouded judgment. He placed both palms flat on his desk and inhaled slowly. Where is he now? He asked. At Harlem Hospital. The drive was silent. Outside, the city continued unaware. Streetcars rattled. Vendors packed up fruit stands. Somewhere, a woman laughed at a joke drifting from a club doorway. But inside that automobile, the air thickened with something heavier than sorrow. Bumpy's driver glanced at him once through the rearview mirror and quickly looked away. The expression on Bumpy's face was not rage. It was resolve forming. At the hospital, Isaiah's mother collapsed into Bumpy's arms. Her sobs were raw, unfiltered. She did not ask for revenge. She asked for dignity, for her son not to be remembered as a spectacle. Bumpy held her gently, whispering words too quiet for the hallway to hear. In that moment, he made a promise. Not with fire, but with steel. The police report arrived the next morning. It spoke of unknown assailants. It suggested gang involvement. It implied reckless association. It never once mentioned racial hatred. It never once acknowledged the rope burns on Isaiah's wrists or the markings on the wooden beam above him that resembled symbols long associated with terror in the South. Harlem read between the lines. By Wednesday afternoon, tension had begun to simmer. Young men gathered on stoops, fists clenched, speaking of retaliation. Rumors circulated that men affiliated with extremist sympathies had been seen drinking at a downtown social club frequented by certain off-duty officers. The implication was clear. Protection might have been extended to those responsible. In a back room of a jazz club after hours, Bumpy met with community leaders, pastors, business owners, educators. Smoke curled toward the ceiling as arguments flared. "They think we're still scared," one man said. "They think we'll riot and prove them right," said another. "They want chaos," Bumpy replied quietly, his voice cut through the room not because it was loud, but because it carried clarity. "This was not just murder," he continued, "it was invitation. They want Harlem to burn so they can claim we are the flame." Silence settled. He let it linger. If we answer blindly, we lose twice. That evening, across town in an office polished in dark mahogany, Dutch Schultz received his own report. Though once adversaries, Schultz and Bumpy had learned to respect each other's territories. Schultz understood commerce, understood balance. A racially motivated lynching in Harlem was not just cruelty, it was instability. And instability threatened every enterprise in the borough. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed not in prejudice but in analysis. "Find out who facilitated it," he instructed calmly. "Not who swung fists. Who opened doors." Meanwhile, Harlem braced. On Thursday, a march was proposed. Angry, righteous, understandable. Bumpy walked alone to the site where Isaiah had been found. The rail yard was quiet now, only the hum of distant trains punctuating the air. He stood beneath the water tower and studied the ground. No chalk outline remained. No police tape fluttered. The city had already begun pretending. He knelt, touching the dirt where his nephew's shadow had last fallen. "They wanted fear," he murmured to himself. "We will give them something else." The turning point came not with gunfire, not with confrontation, but with a letter on Friday morning. Bumpy Johnson walked into the offices of 3 major New York newspapers. He did not storm in, he requested appointments. He wore a charcoal suit, tie perfectly knotted. In each office, he presented evidence quietly collected. Photographs taken before the rail yard had been cleared. Testimonies from dock workers who saw unfamiliar men escorted by a patrol car the night Isaiah disappeared. Symbols carved into wood beams that reporters recognized from Southern archives. He did not accuse wildly. He did not threaten exposure. He said only this: if this city believes it is different from the South, now is the moment to prove it. Journalists understood the weight of that statement. Public scrutiny was a weapon sharper than any blade. By Saturday, headlines began shifting. Possible extremist ties in Harlem death. Questions surround police conduct. The narrative was no longer confined to whispers in barbershops. It reached Midtown. It reached City Hall. The police commissioner, faced with mounting pressure, ordered an internal review. Officers who had once laughed too loudly at racist jokes found themselves called into quiet rooms with stern-faced supervisors. A patrolman resigned. Another requested leave. The social club downtown abruptly closed for renovations. Harlem watched. Saturday night, instead of riot, there was vigil. Candles flickered along Lenox Avenue. Choir voices rose, not in rage but in remembrance. Mothers held sons tightly. Fathers stood with hands clasped behind their backs, jaws firm. Bumpy stood among them, not elevated, not central, simply present. The crowd expected a speech. They received only a few words. "We will not surrender our dignity," he said. That is what they tried to hang. Those words traveled faster than anger ever could. They disarmed the trap set for them. No riot erupted, no storefront burned. And in that restraint, Harlem displayed a power impossible to caricature. By Sunday morning, a city that had hoped the incident would fade found itself under national scrutiny. Editorials condemned hate groups. Clergy from other boroughs expressed solidarity. Even business leaders, concerned about reputation, demanded accountability. In private, Dutch Schultz met with intermediaries who had quietly supported extremist sympathies. His message was simple and devoid of menace. This borough thrives on balance. Disturb it again, and every arrangement you depend on will dissolve. He did not need to elaborate. The week ended where it began, in Harlem. But something fundamental had shifted. Fear had been expected. Violence had been anticipated. Instead, composed resistance exposed hidden alliances and forced reluctant authorities to confront their own shadows. Isaiah Johnson was laid to rest under a gray sky. His mother wept, but she did so knowing her son's death had not been reduced to silence. Bumpy stood at the graveside long after others had departed. He removed his hat, letting cool air touch his brow. "This is not over," he said softly. Not as a threat, but as commitment. Above him, Harlem breathed. The music would return, the laughter would return. But so too would vigilance. Because that week had taught them something profound. Hatred thrives on spectacle, but dignity dismantles spectacle. And somewhere, in quiet offices and dimly lit back rooms, men who had believed themselves untouchable began to understand that the most dangerous opponent is not the loudest one. It is the one who answers injustice with strategy. And patience, and a silence heavy enough to shake foundations. The funeral ended, but Harlem did not exhale. Grief had weight. It lingered in stairwells and clung to brownstone windows like condensation. The music returned to the Savoy Ballroom, yes, but it carried a different undertone now. Trumpets still soared, pianos still danced, yet beneath every rhythm there pulsed a question no one dared voice too loudly: who truly held power in this city? Bumpy Johnson did not mistake temporary headlines for justice. He had lived long enough to understand that newspapers printed outrage easily and forgot it just as easily. What mattered was not whether men were embarrassed. What mattered was whether the structure that allowed such cruelty had been weakened. 3 days after Isaiah was laid to rest, Bumpy sat in his office. Above the pharmacy, a legal pad in front of him untouched. The room smelled faintly of menthol and ink. Outside, Harlem's sidewalks carried the steady march of life, but inside that office, the air was still. He replayed the commissioner's public statement in his mind. Carefully worded condemnation, promises of reform, assurances that New York would not tolerate extremist ideology within its institutions. It sounded noble. It also sounded rehearsed. Bumpy leaned back slowly. Men who operated in hatred rarely acted alone. They required permission, if not explicit, then silent. And silence, Bumpy understood better than most, was the most powerful currency in America. A knock came at the door. It was Elijah Carter, a teacher from 137th Street, known for quoting Langston Hughes between arithmetic lessons. Elijah's composure was usually unshakable. Today, it trembled. "They've started again," he said quietly. Bumpy did not ask who. He already knew. But this time, there was no rope, no spectacle. The violence had become quieter, subtle. Black-owned storefronts began receiving unexpected inspection notices. Fire code violations appeared overnight where none had existed for decades. A community printing press that had published articles questioning the police investigation was raided for licensing discrepancies. A local bank denied loans to businesses that had donated to Isaiah's vigil fund. The message had evolved. If Harlem would not riot, it would be suffocated. Bumpy stood and walked to the window. Below him, a fruit vendor arranged oranges in neat pyramids. Children laughed near a hydrant spraying summer mist. On the surface, life appeared untouched, but Bumpy knew patterns. And this pattern was coordinated. "They've traded ropes for paperwork," he murmured. Elijah swallowed. "People are afraid to speak. They don't want to lose what little they've built." Fear, Bumpy knew, did not always wear a hood. Sometimes it wore a badge, sometimes it wore a business suit. That evening, Bumpy requested a private meeting with Dutch Schultz. The two men met in a quiet dining room after hours, the chandeliers dimmed to amber. Schultz poured 2 glasses of seltzer water, declining whiskey, a sign he intended clarity. "They're tightening the screws," Bumpy said evenly. Schultz nodded once. "I've noticed. Inspections, licenses, financial pressure. It's coordinated. Schultz leaned forward slightly. You're saying the men who embarrassed themselves last week have friends who prefer quieter tools. I'm saying, Bumpy replied, that power resents being exposed. Silence hung between them, not hostile but calculating. Schultz understood something many underestimated. Harlem's economic vitality was intertwined with broader networks. If black-owned businesses collapsed, supply chains shifted. Money moved. And when money moved abruptly, it disrupted more than one borough. You want me to lean on someone, Schultz said finally. Bumpy shook his head slowly. No, I want you to listen. He reached into his coat and placed a thin folder on the table. Inside were copies of inspection records, identical phrasing across multiple businesses, signed by the same 3 city officials. Attached were bank letters denying credit extensions to store owners with impeccable repayment histories. They think they can starve us quietly, Bumpy said. Schultz studied the pages. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with recognition. This isn't about the clan anymore, he said softly. This is about preserving hierarchy. Bumpy's expression did not change. It always was. The turning of the tide did not begin with confrontation. It began with numbers. Bumpy spent the next 2 days visiting shopkeepers one by one. He did not promise revenge. He did not encourage defiance. Instead, he gathered data: revenue, expenses, inspection anomalies, loan denials. Harlem, he knew, was not just culture. It was commerce. On the 3rd night, he convened a meeting in the basement of Abyssinian Baptist Church. Not a fiery rally, a strategy session. We have been attacked, Bumpy began calmly, but not with fists, with paperwork. A murmur rippled through the room. They want us to break quietly, he continued. So we will answer publicly. He outlined a plan so unexpected that even Elijah blinked. Instead of protesting, instead of striking, Harlem's businesses would close voluntarily for 1 day. Every barber shop, every grocer, every tailor. Not in anger, in unity. They would hang signs in their windows. Close today to honor justice. No accusations, no threats, just absence. Schultz, informed discreetly, understood the brilliance immediately. 1 day of economic silence in Harlem would ripple through suppliers, through distribution routes, through entertainment venues dependent on nightly traffic. The city would notice. And on that morning, Lenox Avenue looked unfamiliar. Metal shutters. Lowered not in fear, but in choreography. Doors locked in synchronization. Music did not spill from clubs. Even the Savoy remained dark. Police patrols increased, expecting unrest. Instead, they found emptiness. By midday, delivery trucks idled with nowhere to unload. By afternoon, Midtown offices received calls from distributors asking why Harlem's orders had halted. By evening, newspapers arrived to photograph streets that usually pulsed with life standing still. The headline the next morning did not mention extremism. It mentioned economic impact. Harlem businesses staged coordinated closure. City Hall felt the tremor. The commissioner requested another meeting. Bumpy entered once again alone. You're destabilizing commerce, the commissioner said stiffly. No, Bumpy replied calmly. We're demonstrating its value. He slid forward a document, a compilation of inspection irregularities and financial discrimination. He did not accuse individuals by name. He did not demand arrests. He said something far more dangerous. If this continues, we will extend our silence, not in anger, in mathematics. The commissioner understood. 1 day had caused disruption. A week could cause embarrassment on a scale City Hall could not afford, especially with national newspapers already attentive. Within 48 hours, inspection orders were reviewed. 2 officials were reassigned. Loan denials were quietly reversed. The printing press resumed operation. No grand apology was issued. No parade celebrated victory. But the suffocation ceased. That Sunday evening, Harlem reopened. Music returned, not triumphant, but steady. A resilience reaffirmed. Dutch Schultz visited Bumpy's office quietly. "You didn't threaten," Schultz observed. "No, you didn't strike. No, you made them blink." Bumpy adjusted the papers on his desk. "No," he corrected gently. "I reminded them we exist." Outside, Isaiah's younger cousins played stickball in the street. Laughter rose again without trembling. Storefronts glowed warm beneath street lamps. Harlem had not burned. It had paused. And in that pause, it had proven something essential. That dignity, when organized, could move markets. That unity, when disciplined, could disarm power structures more effectively than violence ever could. The men who had believed fear would scatter the neighborhood had miscalculated. Because Harlem did not answer hatred with chaos. It answered with coordination. And somewhere inside City Hall, a quiet realization settled. The most dangerous force in any city is not anger. It is a community that has learned how to stand still together and refuse to disappear. The day Harlem reopened, the music sounded stronger, but the city beyond 125th Street had not surrendered its pride. So easily. Power does not like to blink. It especially does not like to blink in public. For a brief moment, it had seemed as though the economic silence had corrected the imbalance. Inspections softened. Bank letters reversed. Patrol cars rolled through Harlem with less theatrical intimidation. The newspapers found a new scandal to chase, but beneath that surface calm, another current began to form. Bumpy Johnson sensed it before anyone else spoke of it. He had lived long enough to recognize when silence was genuine and when it was rehearsed. On a gray Thursday morning, he stood outside the Savoy Ballroom watching the crowd disperse after a matinee rehearsal. A young trumpeter laughed as he adjusted his case strap. Couples leaned against the brick walls whispering promises. Harlem breathed again, yet across the street, two unfamiliar men leaned against a lamppost. Hats pulled low, coats too heavy for the weather. They weren't locals. They weren't tourists. They were observers, and observers always reported back to someone. By nightfall, rumors reached Bumpy's desk. A federal task force had been quietly assembled. Officially, it was to investigate organized racketeering and economic coercion. Unofficially, it was retaliation dressed in legality. They could not accuse Harlem of violence, so they would accuse it of structure. Dutch Schultz confirmed the whispers. "They're not coming at you with ropes," Schultz said in his office, voice low and measured. "They're coming with indictments." Bumpy nodded once. "I expected as much. They want to make an example. They already tried." Schultz leaned back, studying the man across from him. In another life, they might have remained adversaries. But this moment transcended rivalry. This was not about territory. This was about narrative. "They think you orchestrated a shutdown. That embarrassed City Hall," Schultz continued. "They'll argue coercion, extortion." Bumpy's expression did not change. "We closed our own doors. That won't matter." It wouldn't, because in America power often rewrote definitions to suit its comfort. By Friday afternoon, subpoenas were delivered to several Harlem business owners. They were summoned to testify before a grand jury investigating economic conspiracy. The implication was clear. Harlem's unity would be reframed as criminal coordination. Fear returned, quieter this time, but sharper. Elijah Carter arrived at Bumpy's office that evening, eyes clouded. "They're going to break us apart one by one," he said. "If the shopkeepers testify against you, they'll protect their own families." Bumpy folded his hands calmly on the desk. "They won't need to testify against me," he replied. Elijah frowned. "How can you be sure?" "Because I will. Testify first." The words settled heavily between them. "You?" Elijah's voice dropped. "They're waiting for that." "Yes, and you're walking into it?" Bumpy rose slowly and walked to the window. Lenox Avenue shimmered under streetlights, the glow reflecting off polished shoes and chrome bumpers. "They expect defiance," he said quietly. "They expect resistance. What they don't expect is composure." The grand jury hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. Word spread quickly. Some urged Bumpy to avoid it. Others whispered that he should flee temporarily, let the legal storm pass. Even Dutch Schultz, pragmatic as ever, offered a cautious suggestion. "You don't owe them your presence." Schultz said, "I owe Harlem mine," Bumpy replied. Monday arrived cold and bright. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, cameras flashing in bursts. The headlines had already begun drafting themselves. Harlem power broker under investigation. Economic manipulation alleged. Bumpy stepped from the car alone. No entourage. No bodyguards. His suit was dark navy, his tie simple, his hat perfectly angled. He walked past the crowd without expression, without acknowledgement of shouted questions. Inside the courtroom, the air smelled of polished wood and expectation. The prosecutor began methodically. "Mr. Johnson, did you instruct businesses to close?" "No." Bumpy replied evenly. "I asked them if they believed in their own value. Did you imply consequences if they refused?" "I implied unity." Murmurs flickered through the room. The prosecutor shifted tone. "Were you aware that the coordinated closure caused economic disruption across borough lines?" "Yes." "And you intended that disruption?" Bumpy paused, not searching for words but selecting them carefully. "I intended reflection." A subtle ripple moved through the gallery. The prosecutor frowned. "Reflection?" "When a community pauses its commerce voluntarily," Bumpy said calmly, "it is not extortion. It is demonstration. We demonstrated our contribution." The questioning intensified. The prosecutor attempted to frame leadership as coercion, influence as manipulation. But Bumpy never raised his voice. He never deflected. He never attacked. Instead, he did something far more disarming. He humanized. He spoke of Isaiah, not in anger, not as accusation. He described a young man who loved mathematics, who walked elderly neighbors home from church, who dreamed of attending city college. He spoke of inspection letters, arriving days after funeral candles burned out, of loan denials, timed too precisely to feel coincidental. He did not accuse the city outright. He asked questions. Is unity illegal? He asked gently. Is choosing when to open one's own store criminal? Is grief allowed to organize itself? The prosecutor attempted to redirect, but the tone had shifted. Reporters leaned forward. Jurors exchanged glances. Outside, Harlem waited. Hours passed. When Bumpy stepped from the courthouse that afternoon, there was no verdict yet, only deliberation. But something had already changed. That evening's newspapers did not read as expected. Instead of depicting a criminal mastermind, they described the composed community leader defending the right of business owners to act collectively in dignity. Editorials began questioning the foes began questioning the right of business owners to act collectively in dignity. Editorials began questioning the shindy. Investigation's motivation. Is economic solidarity a federal crime? One headline asked. City Hall, already bruised from prior scrutiny, felt the pressure mounting again. Behind closed doors, political advisors urged caution. He's too calm, one warned. He looks reasonable. Reasonableness in a moment designed for outrage was destabilizing. On Wednesday, the grand jury declined to issue indictments for lack of evidence of coercion. The task force dissolved. As quietly as it had formed. No apology followed. No official acknowledgement of overreach. But Harlem understood. That night, as music once again filled the Savoy, Dutch Schultz joined Bumpy on the rooftop of a brownstone overlooking the avenue. "You walked straight into their net," Schultz said, lighting a cigarette. "And?" Bumpy asked. "They couldn't tighten it." Bumpy looked out over Harlem, the glow of neon signs, the rhythm of passing cars, the silhouettes dancing through club windows. They mistook unity for aggression, he said softly, and dignity for weakness. Schultz exhaled smoke into the night air. They won't forget this. No, Bumpy replied. They won't. But neither would Harlem. The week had proven something beyond economics and beyond law. It had proven that power, when confronted by steady composure, faltered. It had proven that narratives could be reclaimed not through force, but through clarity. And it had proven that the most unsettling presence in a courtroom is not fury. It is a man who refuses to lose his temper, because anger is predictable. Calm is not. Below them. Laughter rose into the night. Isaiah's absence would never be undone. But his name was no longer whispered in fear. It was spoken in strength. And somewhere in the corridors of authority, a lesson lingered. Harlem was not a flame to be extinguished. It was a foundation. And foundations, when tested, do not scream. They hold, and in holding, they change the shape of everything built above them. Winter came early that year. Harlem's brownstones were a thin crust of frost, and the breath of passers-by curled upward like smoke from invisible chimneys. The Savoy's lights still burned warm against the cold, but even the music carried a deeper tone now, less carefree, more deliberate. Something had shifted in the borough over the past weeks, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The grand jury's refusal to indict had stunned those who had expected humiliation. City officials had quietly recalibrated their posture. Patrol cars still rolled through Harlem, but the exaggerated swagger had softened. Inspection notices arrived, less frequently. Loan applications were processed with new caution. Power had not been defeated, but it had been studied. And in being studied, it had grown careful. Bumpy Johnson understood that caution was not transformation. He knew better than to confuse temporary retreat with permanent change. Systems did not dissolve in weeks. They adapted. What he did not anticipate was how personal the next move would become. It began with a letter. No return address. No signature. Inside, a single sentence. You embarrassed the wrong men. Bumpy read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it inside his desk drawer. He did not show it to Elijah. He did not show it to Dutch. Threats were only effective when they provoked visible reaction. He offered none, but within days, something subtle began happening again, this time not through inspections or subpoenas, but through influence. A prominent Harlem landlord, who had quietly supported the economic closure, was suddenly denied refinancing on multiple properties. A local theater owner was informed that her license renewal would be delayed for review. A church applying for renovation permits found its paperwork lost in bureaucratic corridors. Not coordinated enough to make headlines, just precise enough to intimidate. Bumpy sat in his office late one evening, reviewing each incident carefully. The pattern was quieter than before, smarter, designed to erode confidence without sparking unity. He leaned back in his chair, eyes thoughtful rather than angry. They've learned, he murmured. A knock interrupted him. It was Dutch Schultz. Schultz rarely arrived unannounced. Tonight, his expression was unusually tight. You're being boxed, Schultz said plainly. They're isolating your allies. I've noticed. They want to make association with you inconvenient. Bumpy gave the faintest nod. It was predictable. Schultz stepped closer to the desk. This isn't about race now. It's about ego. You made them look small. I did nothing, Bumpy replied calmly. They looked small on their own. Schultz studied him for a long moment. What's your move? Bumpy stood slowly and walked to the window. Snow had begun falling, soft flakes drifting through. Amber streetlight. I removed myself, he said quietly. Schultz blinked. You what? I stepped back, Schultz frowned. That's surrender. No, Bumpy replied evenly. It's misdirection. The plan was not announced publicly. It unfolded quietly. Over the next 2 weeks, Bumpy reduced his visible presence in Harlem's civic meetings. He stopped appearing at storefront gatherings. He declined interviews. He let Elijah, pastors, and business owners take the forefront. Whispers spread quickly. Had the pressure worked? Was he retreating? City officials, observing from a distance, relaxed slightly. The narrative began shifting again, this time towards speculation that Harlem's unity had depended solely on one man's influence. That was the mistake, because unity, once experienced, does not evaporate. It evolves. Without Bumpy at the center, something extraordinary happened. Harlem did not fracture. It organized. Independently, business owners form a cooperative council, not under Bumpy's name, but under their own. Churches created a shared legal defense fund. Teachers hosted forums on civic rights. The landlord denied refinancing, found private investors within the community willing to support him directly. The influence had decentralized. And decentralization cannot be subpoenaed. One evening in early February, a meeting was held at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. The pews were full, the mood steady. Bumpy sat in the back row, head resting on his knee. No one introduced him. No one deferred to him. They didn't need to. Elijah stood at the pulpit and spoke of economic literacy. A seamstress spoke of cooperative purchasing. A grocer discussed collective insurance policies. Harlem was building its own scaffolding. Outside the church, 2 city officials stood watching. From across the street, they expected agitation. They saw organization. That was far more unsettling. The real turning point came unexpectedly, not from confrontation, not from protest, but from invitation. A city councilman, aware of the shifting political winds, requested a private meeting with Harlem's cooperative council. Not with Bumpy. With Harlem, the council agreed. The meeting was held in a municipal conference room overlooking the East River. Snow still lined the streets. The air inside was sterile, formal. The councilman began cautiously. "There have been misunderstandings," he said. Elijah responded calmly. "There have been patterns." The council presented documented evidence of discriminatory delays and selective enforcement, not emotionally, not accusatorily. Methodically, they proposed policy changes, transparent inspection procedures, standardized timelines for license approvals, oversight committees including community representatives. The councilman listened, because now he had to. Public opinion had shifted. Newspapers had taken interest in Harlem's structured approach. Other neighborhoods quietly admired the model. Refusal would not cause riot. It would cause embarrassment. Within a month, procedural reforms were drafted. Not revolutionary, not perfect, but real. Back in Harlem, life moved with new steadiness. On a cold Sunday afternoon, Bumpy walked alone past the rail yard where Isaiah had been found months earlier. The water tower still stood, silent and indifferent. Snow softened the edges of memory. He did not kneel this time. He stood tall. The rope had been meant to provoke chaos. The retaliation had been meant to isolate him. The investigations had been meant to intimidate. Instead, Harlem had become stronger, more organized, less dependent on singular leadership. Bumpy had not won by overpowering anyone. He had won by refusing to perform anger. That evening, he returned to Lenox Avenue. Music spilled from the Savoy. Again, bright, defiant, alive. Couples danced without glancing nervously over shoulders. Shop windows glowed warm against winter's bite. Dutch Schultz approached him outside the club, coat collar turned up against the cold. "You stepped back," Schultz said quietly. "Yes, and they lost leverage." Bumpy gave a faint smile. "Power that depends on one man isn't power." Schultz studied the street. The businesses thriving, the laughter rising, the cooperative notices pinned proudly to bulletin boards. "You changed the board," Schultz said. No, Bumpy corrected gently. They did. Inside the club, a trumpet climbed into a high triumphant note. Isaiah's name was no longer attached only to grief. A scholarship fund had been created in his honor, funded by the Cooperative Council, supported by churches, endorsed quietly by city officials eager to mend perception. Young men who once whispered about revenge now whispered about college. Applications. The silence that had once meant fear now meant discipline, and discipline meant longevity. Late that night, as snow began falling again, Bumpy stood at his office window overlooking Harlem. He removed the threatening letter from his desk drawer and read it once more. You embarrassed the wrong men. He folded it carefully and placed it back. They had misunderstood something fundamental. Embarrassment fades. Structure remains. Harlem was no longer reacting. It was designing. And the most powerful transformation had not been visible in headlines or courtrooms. It had been internal. A community that once looked to one man for protection had learned to protect itself through organization. That was not rebellion. That was maturity. Outside, laughter carried into the night. The city had tried rope. It had tried paperwork. It had tried intimidation. Harlem answered with composure. And composure, sustained long enough, becomes legacy. Bumpy Johnson turned off the lamp in his office and stepped into the cold night air. He did not need applause. He did not need acknowledgement. The greatest victories are not loud. They are lived. And Harlem, standing tall beneath winter's quiet sky, was living proof.